afternoon, everyone. Thank you well for having me here today. It's an honor to be invited. And thank you well for your attention. This slide usually goes at the end of slide decks, but because my topic today is attention, I thought it would make sense to put it at the beginning as well. You know, we like to call our time the information age. And it is true there's more information in our lives than ever before. Talk about big data is everywhere. But I want to start with back in the 1970s with an observation made by the noted economist and cyberneticist Herbert Simon, who pointed out that when information becomes abundant, attention becomes the scarce resource. So most of human history has been lived in environments of information scarcity. And the job of an information technology was to break down the boundaries between us and information. But now, with information being abundant, attention is now the scarce thing. And I think it's the job of our technologies to help us shape our attention in the way we want to shape it. And I think this is a shift that has happened so quickly in our lives that we're only really beginning to understand what it means, this shift between information and attention. But because attention is now the scarce resource, it's the object of competition for most of the technologies that we use every day. And the environment in which all these technologies compete for our attention is often called the attention economy. So over the last 30 years or so, three things have come into conversation. First, the advertising industry, the justification for which was always that it gives us more information that helps us make a better purchasing decision. That came into conversation with new remarkable advances in our knowledge of human psychology, especially non-rational psychology, that we've been applying in various contexts, including design, since then. But then thirdly, the infrastructure of measurement, optimization, message delivery, experimentation, analytics afforded by the internet. And the union of these three trends has produced a situation in which we now live, in which we might think of it as a kind of industrialized persuasion being the default business model of the internet. But even more than that, this industrialized persuasion is increasingly centralized. In fact, I think it's more centralized than any form of power in human history. If you think about it, a few people in a few conference rooms in one state, in one country, will go to work today and shape what billions of people are thinking and doing. That's a kind of power that no country or empire or religion has ever had in history. And I think it's a cause for us to really think about this as a political and indeed a moral question for us to grapple with. And so this environment, this attention economy, because the competition is so fierce, designers increasingly have to appeal to those non-rational parts of our psychology, to our impulses as opposed to our intentions, in order to get us to continue to keep clicking and tapping and scrolling and looking at their products. And so I think to think about this in terms of industrialized persuasion means, for most of human history, persuasion has been a kind of handicraft thing. Even in advertising, there was the famous quote, somebody said, "Half my ad spend is wasted, but I don't know which half." But now we've kind of moved persuasion from being an art to a science, and it's getting better every day, more powerful every day, and this is the logic of the technologies that now shape so much of our lives. And increasingly, they're shaping our lives, our behavior, our thinking toward certain goals that may or may not be the ones that we have for ourselves. So if you think about your goals for yourself, whether that's why you're here today, this week, or what you want to do with yourself this year or beyond, there are probably things like, most people say, I'm going to spend more time with family, I want to develop a skill, like learn to play the piano, or I want to plan that trip that I've been putting off for too long. These are the real human goals. If you ask people, these are the kinds of things they say. And so, to me, if technology is for anything, it's for helping us pursue those goals. But if you look at the goals that technology is designed toward mostly in the attention economy, it tends to be these lower level engagement goals. Things like maximize the amount of time you spend with an app or on a site, or the number of clicks or taps that you make, or how much time, how much attention how many impressions you're giving to a certain ad or web page. And I think this is a big problem because, I don't know anybody who has those goals for themselves. I don't know anybody who wakes up in the morning and says, how much time can I possibly spend on Facebook today? But I think this is a big problem because we trust these technologies to kind of be like GPSs for our lives, to kind of get us to where we want to go. But if they're not actually programmed to get us where we want to go, if they're just programmed to get us to take a turn in some other direction, to me, I think that's a really big problem at the heart of current technology design. And so I think we have to acknowledge then the prevalence of that kind of design means that the inconvenient truth about the attention economy is that it isn't on our side like we trust it to be. Its goals are usually not our goals. Its values aren't usually our values. And I think this is one of the biggest political and moral questions of our time because, we've made this mistake before. As Aldous Huxley pointed out when he was talking about the defenders of freedom in his time. In Brave New World Revisited, he said that they failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. When it comes to the threats to human freedom, to making our lives go well that we've been attuned to, we've really given attention to the coercive types of threat, the Orwellian threats, the boot stamping on the human face forever, not the more persuasive, seductive sorts of threats that might even be things we enjoy in that moment, but which in the longer term aren't necessarily conducive to our well-being or our goals. So how can we avoid making this mistake moving forward? How can we start to take into account our almost infinite appetite for distractions? I think it means starting to assert and defend a type of freedom that we haven't had to defend in the past, namely a freedom of attention. In the era of information scarcity, freedom of expression, freedom of speech was and still is rightly held up as sacred, as something to be defended. But now the threats to freedom are not only informational, they're also attentional. And so I think we need to develop new ways of talking about this sort of freedom of attention in order to get around these problems. So I think that means finding new ways to talk about attention itself. So when we talk about attention, in day-to-day parlance, we normally mean what cognitive scientists call the spotlight of attention. So it's the way we're all giving attention to each other right now, managing our awareness in the task domain. So for instance, design might frustrate the spotlight of our attention when it inverts default conditions in design. So click here if you would not like to receive this great offer. Or it can be notifications and interruptions. This is an extremely common form of undermining the spotlight of our attention. For instance, Android, the operating system, notifies users 11 billion times per day. That's 11 billion pings on human beings' attention. In the same way, users are checking their phones 150 times a day on average. So these are continued interruptions of our spotlight of our attention. For instance, let's say I'm trying to read a book and then the president of my country decides that my phone vibrates and he decided this is what he wants to tell his constituents today. So we're all used to this sort of thing, but the thing about undermining our spotlight of our attention is these interruptions, these distractions add up, and actions become habits, and we become habituated into a certain way of living. So attention becomes not just then about doing what we want to do, but also over the longer term, being who we want to be, living by the values we want to live by, having the identity we want to have. So when technology undermines this sort of attention, it usually happens by the creation of new habits. So for instance, in the infinite scrolling feeds, one very common way this happens is by the application of a dynamic known as intermittent variable rewards, which is essentially the slot machine effect. It's what makes gambling machines so compulsive. When you randomize the reward that you give somebody, they'll perform that action more. So when we pull down to refresh, we're playing an informational slot machine. The psychological dynamics are the same. And then when we internalize these dynamics and we start to live by these values of the design, it gets us to prioritize things in our life and in our politics like fame. There was a study that showed that children's television shows now prioritize fame as value most worth pursuing, as opposed to 15 years ago when it was things like that were more pro-social, like community values and togetherness, this type of thing. And similarly, I think pettiness is something that we see on the rise in our world. And I think this is very well represented by last February when the CEO of CBS, one of the main television stations in the United States, said that Trump's candidacy may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. It's this kind of short-term thinking and this kind of pettiness that is the logic of the design of the attention economy. And because we use it and make that the logic of our lives, it manifests in ways such as this. So attention isn't just doing what we want to do, it's also about being who we want to be. But I think there's one level deeper of attention we could talk about. And I think that's when it gets in the way of creating our goals and defining what our values are in the first place. So we could call this level of attention the daylight of our attention. It's the type of attention, the set of capacities that allows us to really do anything else. So this would be about undermining our cognitive capacities, so undermining intelligence. A study by Hewlett-Packard a little while back found that repeated distractions can lower people's IQ by around 10 IQ points, which I would point out is a greater decrease than you see from long-term marijuana usage. Similarly, I think our faculties of prediction, on which we rely for the media so much to help us develop, I think are being undermined by the forces of the attention economy. So before the US election, you would go to a website and see this type of prediction, statistical prediction, and I think what happened was that the little changes in the percentage of the chance a candidate had became that reward that was pulling people back in, keeping them coming back, so that then the site could sell more ads. So maybe this is almost, if we have clickbait, we could almost think of this as like stat bait or statistical clickbait. And this seems to me like to be really problematic. But I think the biggest way we see the daylight of our attention being undermined by far is in the way in which the attention economy selects for behaviors of outrage in us. So outrage was very useful when we lived in small tribes. An outrage is kind of the angry impulse to judge or punish. But at the scale of societies or of the world as a whole, it's very counterproductive. And it seems like every week we have some big outrage cascade where the entire internet comes down on one person for some perceived misdeed in order to destroy them. So we can't burn them at the stake, so the goal becomes to destroy them symbolically, reputationally. So for instance, the Minnesotan dentist a little while back who went to Zimbabwe and killed a lion named Cecil. It was a stupid thing to do, shouldn't have done it. But what happened was this kind of public shaming. And again, we see this like every week, it seems, if not every day, in different ways. And it's not to say that things that people are angry about are things they shouldn't be angry about. A lot of these things are very bad. But the way in which we are angry about them and the way in which we sort of pursue justice is akin to mob rule. This is not justice on any standard notion that we have in Western liberal democracies. And mob rule is, of course, what Socrates viewed as the way that societies go from being democracies into being tyrannies. So this is a very quick overview, but I think this has been a kind of, the goal here has been to deepen our understanding of attention beyond just questions of doing what we want to do, distractions in the task domain, but getting to questions of being who we want to be, and in a deeper sense, wanting what we want to want. And this is the way Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher at Princeton, thinks about the structure of the human will. And I think that at the end of the day, that's what's at stake with the attention economy. It's the human will. Sometimes I like to say that the attention economy is essentially a distributed denial of service attack on the human will. But the human will is the basis of the authority of democracy. And so I think that this is a very clear and urgent threat to our democratic systems. So what do we do about this? Aristotle said in politics, it's disgraceful to be unable to use our good things. And it is disgraceful, but these are good things. I'm very pro-technology. The goal of technology is to help us be successful in life. And that's the great potential that it carries for us. And if we can reform these dynamics, reform the system, I think we can move it in that direction. And so there are a lot of things to say here, far more than I have time to talk about today. But kind of getting back to this, the standard of a GPS, technology ought to help us get to where we want to go in the way that we want to get there. No one would put up with a GPS that did what the attention economy does if it distracted us in physical space the way the attention economy distracts us in informational space. If you put in a destination and it took you to a destination on the complete other side of town, you wouldn't keep using that GPS. You'd throw it out the window of your car, stomp on it, return it on Amazon, whatever. So what do we do? So the usual response is to say users need to adapt. Users need to just come to terms with this new world that's competing for their attention and just work harder. And I think that we should just reject this kind of rhetoric on its face, because this is essentially saying that thousands of the world's smartest PhD engineers, designers, scientists are going to work every day to undermine your willpower. So the answer is you just need to have more willpower. I don't think that that really is tenable as a solution. But at the same time, we can't blame the designers or the company leaders. W. Edwards Deming said a bad system will beat a good person every time. And I think that's what we have, is we have good players playing a bad game. And I think the task then should not be to blame the players, come down on the players. It should be to change the game, change the rules. Another way of putting this is that this isn't an ethical question of individual actors. This is a question of what philosopher Luciano Floridi calls infraethics, or the ethics of the infrastructure. And so there are many types of infraethical innovations, reforms, tweaks that we need to do to reform the attention economy. And some of the categories are listed here. And I'll just go through a few of them due to time. But I think one thing that we can change, that we can all start changing today, is the way we talk about these technologies and the way we talk about what we want them to do for us. For instance, we could change the way we talk about persuasion. This is a very muddy area linguistically. There's all sorts of ways of talking about persuasion in different domains. But I think, what if we were to this would be a starting point, but we could say, on the y-axis we have the degree to which a technology constrains us in some way. On the x-axis you have the degree to which it's aligned with your goals. So we could say a technology that is highly aligned with my goals, but very low constraint would be a directive technology, whereas one that is very high constraint but low goal alignment would be a seductive technology. So this is a first pass, but I think we need more kind of maps like this to help us navigate this domain of persuasion. I think we also need to ask what advertising is for in an information-abundant environment. Because as I said, the justification was always that it gives us more information to help us make better purchasing decisions. This is a bit jargony, but you could say that in the past, advertising was a proactive appeal for some resource of value in a way that sort of overrode the dominant design logic or goals for information delivery. So in other words, advertising has always been an exception to the rule. It's been the box in the corner of the newspaper page or the commercial break between the show. It was underwriting the content, but now I think advertising has moved to where it's overriding the content. The content serves the advertising format, and then you get things like clickbait. Another thing that I think, having worked in advertising industry for a while, I think there's an opportunity to avoid sort of negative euphemisms when we talk about users, the people's lives that we're shaping day to day. So using human words for human beings. So terms like funnels, putting humans in funnels doesn't seem to me to be a good metaphor for anything, really. Or I think even, metonymy like eyeballs or targeting. There's a way that we could humanize this, and I think this is a project that any of you could start experimenting with in your organizations today. How do we talk more humanly about human beings? I think having the right metrics is another important part of this. So in the era of big data, of information abundance, the challenge that individuals and organizations face is they just by default start valuing what they already measure. But I think that the task is to then take a step back and make sure that we're measuring what we actually value. So don't go from the data, the metrics, to the goals. Go from the goals to the metrics. So this means getting past short-term attentional engagement metrics and starting to think about the longer-term indicators of deeper benefit to users, whether that's happiness, well-being, or whatever else. In other words, getting beyond measuring the value that you get from them and starting to measure the value that you give. So think about what's that net positive benefit that you provide to users. And I think most of the time this will have to do with thinking in terms of the user's intentions, not their attention. So one way that anyone in this room probably could start doing this today is to think, okay, what is the mission statement of my organization? Because most organizations have mission statements, exist for some reason. But rarely have I talked to people who actually operationalize that mission statement, who measure success toward that mission. And to me, that's a really big, problematic omission. So I think this is something that could be done within organizations to say, okay, here are, given our current business model, current objectives, here are the metrics, but then given our social benefit, we're actually trying to provide a society, here's how we're doing on that front, so at least there can start to be a conversation between the two. Some other areas, just kind of quickly, in terms of kind of market pressures to reform the attention economy, I think investors, if they were to invest in companies that were trying to not just get users to spend their time with the product, but to spend it well, that would be a big win, as well as creating more public pressure and accountability to design in ways that are conducive to users' longer-term needs and values. From a legal regulatory point of view, I think we really need kind of corporate structures beyond kind of the usual ones. So benefit corporations are an example where companies can define a social good goal as well as their financial goal, and they have some freedom to balance those things. Business models beyond advertising, and again, having business models that are structured around supporting users' intentions, not exploiting their attention. If advertising as a whole enterprise could move from attention to intention, I think that would be an enormous boon for society and even humanity as a whole. So in closing, looking ahead, Winston Churchill said the empires of the future are the empires of the mind. This is one of my favorite quotes. And the persuasive power of technology is only going to increase. The ubiquity of technology, the way in which it's embedded in our lives is only going to increase. And I think we're at a moment right now where we still have, it's early enough in the process that we can still bake into it the right sorts of goals and values. It's early enough in the process that we can still bring technology to actually be on our side and not being adversarial against us. And as we move into more automation, artificial intelligence, a lot of the design that we can see and touch today, that logic is going to be pushed ever further down to the kind of automation layer where it's harder to actually see or access or to question. And so, and there's so many problems that we have in front of us as individuals, as families, as societies, and humanity as a whole. So many challenges facing this planet. And to really successfully deal with any of them, I think we have to be able to give attention to what matters. And it seems to me that this is exactly what technologies of the attention economy are now undermining. And that's our big challenge, I think, of our time. But I think the great opportunity is, as I said, bringing these systems, bringing these technologies back to be on our side. To me, that's the great potential of technology. And that's why I'm optimistic about the future of technology, because when I talk to people, it resonates so much with them. And I'm very glad that you've invited me here today to talk to you about this. I hope it's resonated with you. And again, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, James. Mr. Williams.